Let's see here. So I'm going to introduce John. Hi, John. Wes. And Kent is going to run this panel. So come on up, guys. This is where it really gets interesting. Can't wait to hear what you guys all have to say. So Kent, lead it off. And the topic of this panel is the future of SMPTE 2110. So we touched on it a bit. Take it away.
Thank you so much. Okay, I'm Kent Terry, and I'm Dolby, but I'm also happen to be the section chair for the SMPTE San Francisco section, and we're happy to partner with the Silicon Valley Video Group to help put this on. And as representatives of SMPTE, we thought we'd sponsor this session and keep it focused on standards, particularly SMPTE standards, but the role of standards in 2110, and particularly the future of 2110. And first of all, operating on the assumption everybody knows what 2110 is. If you don't, come by the SMPTE booth outside. We got a link that'll point you to the standards and what it's all about. We've got experts in the room to teach you. So, speaking of experts, I got two great panelists today, John Mailhot and Wes Simpson, and many of you may know them. If you don't, very heavy hitters in the standards community. You're both heavily involved in many organizations. I know both you, founder of VSF, Wes, and both of you are on VSF committees and very actively involved in developments. You're on MWA as well, and work going on in there. Very much fingers on the pulse of things, and more to the point, we're all heavily involved in the SMPTE organization that are developing the core 2110 standards and the related ones. So
before we dive into this, one of the things I really want to make sure everybody in the audience understands is that we literally wouldn't be sitting here having this conversation if it hadn't been for SMPTE developing a standard, okay? I think people underestimate how important that function is because we kind of take it for granted. It's been out for 5 years and things like that. But all of the things we've been talking about so far this morning, interoperability, testing, getting to the point where vendor A and vendor B can communicate, that all absolutely depends on having a standard that is universal, is worldwide, is agreed on in Europe, in North America, in Japan, and Korea, and every other part of the world. I think that some people take SMPTE for granted. I certainly don't. I know it's a lot of work. There's a lot of things that we have to do. And I also want to just send kudos to my friend John Mailhot here, who was the document editor on SMPTE
Yes.
2110. And I'm so happy that he volunteered literally thousands of hours of his time to make that stuff happen. So thank you, John, for doing that. And, thanks for helping us all get a real standard.
yes, thank you. Otherwise known as chief herder of cats. That's a real role.
It was an interesting process. At the beginning, it's now been about 10 years. If you set your Wayback Machine to 10 years ago and you say, well, 10 gigabit Ethernet was exotic, but you could buy it. And the notion of, let's do HD and everything else over IP, uncompressed, just fling it around, it seemed daft. And now, of course, 100 gig is table stakes, 400 works well, and 800 is orderable. So very different world we live in. But the key thing we did right was that the standard doesn't care what you're running it on as a physical layer, which was a big change maybe from how SDI and other things worked. And being able to leverage those planes and say, look, we're going to define how it works on IP, because IP is already well standardized elsewhere, was an important transformation that we took as a television industry. And of course, people here from the IT space just say, well, of course you did that. But there were some cats that needed to be pulled out of that bag and put into the other bag.
And I think not only that decision, but the decision to base a lot of the core standards on existing IETF standards and build upon what had been before was a great decision. So, but speaking of the core standards, starting with those, the basic standards for what everybody in this room might need if you're going to start out, I think you've stated they're done. Could you please elaborate?
That's my first slide in every deck about 2110. So about 2110 is, by and large, done from a standards perspective. It was all published in 2017. 2017 was 5 years ago now. And it's important that we are that it's there and that we build from it. So there's a lot of work. I published a thing in TV Tech the other day about this same topic, that we're building things on top of it, and those new things all build, like IPMX, but the core standards are done. Now, you will see, if you're an astute observer of SMPTE, that new versions of the 2110 documents were recently published. So if you look online, you'll see a 2022 dated version of 2110, 1020, 2130, so forth. Feel free to diff those. They're not that different. We took the field experience that we had from building real projects for the last 5 years, and as a committee said, okay, what things do we need to clarify? What things do we need to add? What things do we need to say, maybe don't do that? And so the changes are modest. I mean, they are pretty narrow because we wanted to make sure that we didn't disenfranchise things that were built. Instead, we wanted to say, look, people were unclear about this point, let's add some words. People were unclear on how to do that, or maybe we wanted to add a capability, so we added a few capabilities. We added like how to send key signals, things like that weren't in the original. But that's really the nature of the standards process, is you build it and you maintain it. So these are maintenance updates, not some whole new cloth.
Are you sure you're not just trying to talk yourself out of a job?
Well,
I will retire one day.
Yes,
So-
This
yes.
isn't that day.
so the core standards are pretty wrapped up.
Yep.
I mean, there'll be tweaks, and SMPTE does tweak their standards on a regular basis.
We maintain
yes.
standards.
Very
yes.
small, and a lot of that feedback was from testing. A lot of JTM been tested and other practical experience, and that gets fed back. And if we see things that need refining in the standards, they get refined over time. There is still some active work, though, going on in the committee, and one of the things we're working on is 2110-41, right?
Yep, there are some, there's always a little bit of new works. There's two main projects going on in the 2110 drafting group right now. One is a metadata standard called 2110-41 that kind of says generically, how do you send packages of metadata around with timestamps and so forth so they can be synchronized to all the video and audio? And one of the first use cases of that actually is audio metadata, which is why Kent's very excited about it. Not that I'm not excited about it, but it's, he's more excited than me about it. And the other work going on is an engineering guideline around how to use the timestamps and how to define timing planes in a production environment, because the standard gives us tools, but the tools alone don't make a house. You also have to have some idea how you're going to use the tools. And so there's a working group on defining kind of an engineering guideline of how to define timing planes and manage timing.
Well, and I think if we do the job correctly with the timing planes, is that we'll be able to get away from this lockstep. Every time you go through a process, you have to wait another frame's worth of time before you're back in sync with the SMPTE epic. Mm-hmm. It is possible and feasible, and the standard supports it, for you to be able to design a workflow that works in tiny fractions of a frame time. So you can have a switcher operating in less than a frame time. You can have a color processor or some sort of graphics machine. All those things along the way don't need to chew up big chunks of time. And that will allow us to reduce the end-to-end delay through a 2110 workflow. Now, it's all in the standard already. Like John says, the standard already supports that. But without a systematic and consensual way of defining how we're going to do that across a lot of different pieces of equipment, it's hard to make that happen. But that's where we're going. Some guidelines, some test procedures, some other things that are very much going to enrich the ecosystem, but not replace it and not change the foundation we're building on.
Right, and one thing I'll mention, that the drafting group for this had everybody who you'd want to have as a vendor involved in it. So at the peak, there were about 250 members of the drafting group, and we had meetings with over 120 of them present during the, kind of the height of the development of the standard. And so, and of those 120, there were maybe 20 or 30 that had strong opinions. So there was a herding cats element in getting it done, which I'll say was a learning experience for me, but I'm glad we got it done, and I'm glad we got it done in time for it to matter. Because the worst thing that happens to us as an industry, whether television or if you think back to the beginning of IP-based audio, is to have 4 or 5 different competing standards out in the wild, or competing systems out in the wild that each are completely incompatible with the other. I think the audio industry is still recovering from a phase like that.
You bring up a good point. I want to bring that up. Audio is a good example where it started out with a bunch of proprietary systems, and then AS67 came along. And I get your perspective, particularly Wes. I've been working with audio community. They're very popular, systems like Dante and Ravenna. But AS67 seems to have filled the role of a good interoperability standard.
Exactly. Yeah,
and that's what we're all about. Standards about interoperability. It doesn't discount proprietary systems or things that may not fully conform, but if you want to interoperate, standards are the key.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think all of the major audio platforms today have an AES67 mode or an AES67 gateway or an AES67 interoperability profile. And that is key. So now you're getting away from having the single vendor solution, the proprietary solutions and things like that. Fortunately, like John said, with 2110, we were able to get ahead of the curve and avoid having a huge range of different solutions out there for solving that problem. And I think we're much farther ahead as an industry because of that.
Now, that being said, there are some systems out there, and one particular, NDI's got some popularity, and maybe there's some interoperabilities. I'm not sure if there's any work needed on the standard side to make that happen, but there's also cloud systems. CDI being an example with when you're talking to the cloud, that yes, 2110 may not be the preferred format for those kind of systems, and we've got specs for interoperability. Do we see any work coming down the pike, or do the standards cover it?
Well, there's a lot of organizations involved in standards and specs for all this. So SMPTE has been deeply involved at the low layers, at the, what are the packets on the network, that, why is, the video formats, all that. And I think the most enduring part of 2110-20 will actually be the language for describing a video signal. So the specific, width and height and frame rate and all those things, we've defined a set of keywords and values that could be used independent of really what the technology underneath is. And so we're seeing those in use now in the way we describe other signals like NDI signals. In the AMWA, which is a trade association, that's the group that created NMOS and is, like 2110, NMOS also has maintenance releases and so forth. The previous panel covered the ground well, but we had a huge interoperability event last summer in Wuppertal that, why Wuppertal? Because there was a building big enough to host it. There's literally, 70 vendors, about 1.5 people average from each vendor, plus the 20 or so people who were involved, like Wes, in running the tests. Because you don't want a bunch of vendors running the tests, right? You have to have people in the industry who are both knowledgeable and independent. So the EBU plus a set of other people were involved in running those tests, which includes designing and automating. Why do we only do this once a year? Because it's a huge amount of work and frankly an expensive event for everybody involved.
Yeah, I was sitting in the room there and I figured that if everybody was billing at a consultant rate, we were probably burning about $250,000 an hour for that interop event in Wuppertal. But let me just share my observation. So I was on the opposite side of the table from all the vendors. So each time a vendor came through, everybody lined up in very, very orderly fashion. We had to run through a series of tests. And the thing that was tremendously encouraging to me was that a lot of the things that were kind of emergent or marginal or whatever 2 years ago or 3 years ago when we did the last event like that are now rock solid. So everybody's doing the good things. Now we're expanding the test. We're saying, okay, everybody's achieving a base level of media interoperability. Everybody's achieving a base level of being a good network citizen. Now we need to talk about security. We need to talk about control, and those are evolving. I don't think we're there as an industry yet where all the equipment out there is at the same secure, interoperable level from a control standpoint, but we're definitely making progress in that direction. I'm very encouraged to see that.
Yeah, that's a good example. You know, the work is not done. The core standards are great, and they're solid, and we can count on them. I think you said for 50 years. I think they're in good shape for the long-term future. But there's still work to be done in other areas, and some will be done in SMPTE, some in other organizations. So.
Right. I think one of the biggest things that's going on in the sort of standards and trade associations world right now is the work we're doing in VSF on cloud to ground and cloud to cloud workflows. There's a lot of work in the industry now about how do I stand up a workflow in the cloud. What we don't want to do is to just replicate the rigid timing structure we had left over from analog NTSC, right? I mean, a lot of things we do in traditional television are holdbacks from, there used to be a flyback transformer that worked a certain way. If anybody here knows what one is, you should retire. And, why on earth would we inherit stuff like that into, cloud-based production? So there's a lot of work going on in the VSF right now around defining timing models for multi-step workflows in the cloud that are flexible to let the software work ahead, but yet have predictable latency, and then be able to relinearize predictably for the one place where you really have to, which is when people are finally watching it.
Right. So on that subject, going back, I think around the time all three of us started in the industry, SDI was coming out and getting popular. I believe the first standard was published in '89. And by the time I started getting active in this industry, it had taken over. There was very little analog. It came in like wildfire. But it retains that analog legacy, and that to this day. And one of the key designing factors of 2110 was to maintain SDI compatibility, and some of those legacy things come forward. And that's great when we, need it in a workflow. But, coming workflows, that may not be needed, and we can sort of drift away from them. But the question comes up, well, what is the future SDI? I mean, 2110 is not designed to be a replacement for 2110 for SDI in all applications, but certainly in key broadcast ones like routing and things, yeah, it fills that role. But can it be the replacement? Where's, is SDI at the end of the road? And I should mention, I also happen to chair the SMPTE working group on SDI interfaces, and there's not a lot going on.
Well, I think that, if you've met broadcast engineers, right? They will never, ever voluntarily part with a piece of equipment that has some ounce of life left in it.
That is correct. But will anybody sell new equipment? That's another question.
Well, I mean, SDI in flavors and for linkages, there's places where SDI is darn handy. Like, you pull up to the truck dock of a stadium, what's those connectors? They're SDI for a reason, and it's because it provides a very old interface that everyone knows from both sides. So the truck goes and patches in, and the venue patches back some signals, and everybody's happy. Even if it's an IP truck and an IP stadium, that's a 20-minute part of the setup to go fax out all that stuff when it's SDI. If you're trying to do an IP linkage blind between a truck that's never been to that venue and a venue that's never met that truck, pack a lunch.
But so in fairness, I totally agree with what you're saying about the state of things today. But going forward, if you look back, Ethernet has, just like software, eaten the world, okay? I don't think today you could go out and buy a private branch exchange, which I used to work on years and years ago, with two-wire telephone interfaces on the thing. It's all voice over IP. There is no such thing as novelware anymore. There is no such thing as cable TV to the desktop. That was a big thing. That's very much going away. Mm-hmm. And the same thing is going to happen with SDI. It's going to get to the point where people just say, heck, it's a heck of a lot cheaper for me to throw a RJ45 connector on the back of this thing. I buy a little bit of IP from company A and a piece of silicon from company B, and I don't have to worry about it, and I can handle high dynamic range. I can handle weird frame rates. I can handle all sorts of things that are above and beyond the capability of SDI. And they're just, it's going to go away. It's just like again, trying to buy an analog telephone today. Try to do that. It's really tough.
Yeah. Once in a while, I plug in my rotary phone just to see if it's still working. But yeah, so on that subject, IPMX, I mean, the 2110 can be a bit of a heavy lift with the PTP timing. I know IPMX tries to address some of that. Maybe you can speak to that, Wes, and some of the work in VSF, and what's coming with that.
So IPMX, the idea is to take 2110 and the capabilities that are in that system and in a lot of the hardware and software that's out there today, and make that accessible to the Pro AV market. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, it means, first of all, relaxing some of the PTP constraints, because understandably, PTP is a little bit of a science project, getting it up and running. I think that's getting better, but it's certainly not completely done. It's a very complex standard, hundreds and hundreds of pages. And by relaxing some of those requirements, IPMX will provide a better solution. It also handles video essence that's completely asynchronous. So if your video isn't locked to the system reference that 2110 basically assumes that it is, IPMX can still handle that. So what's that going to do for us? Well, first of all, IPMX is slated to be the first completely open specification for video over IP in the market, in the Pro AV market. NDI is not open, SDVOE is not open, HD-Base-T is not open. All of those require either special chipsets or special downloads or licenses to use. IPMX is intended to be a completely open specification. So to me, that's going to be as revolutionary as SDI or 2110. We're making it so that, again, the SMPTE effect, the VSF effect, by making a common standard that absolutely anybody can implement, we're going to enable a much bigger and healthier market.
Yeah, and the key point, it builds on 2110. It doesn't replace it, it builds on it.
Correct.
So,
by definition, every IPMX receiver can receive an ST2110 narrow video stream. It's in the spec. You have to support that.
Yeah, so that will expand the reach of the 2110 core standards and applicability in the industry. And yeah, there may be some additional work from VSF and SMPTE and others to make that happen.
Yeah.
So the work continues.
Let's talk about HDCP and EDID in a different meeting, because that's a lot of heavy lifting, but we'll get there.
Yeah, the EDIDs. I want to find out what standards group came up with that.
Oh, yeah.
And display ID,
So we'll spend the last few minutes here talking about the longer-term future. This is the short-term, what we see coming, what we're doing, but looking ahead where things are headed. Nobody can precisely predict. We don't know what formats are coming, whether it's VR or volumetric kind of video, things like that. But the world progresses when, where's 2110 situated to handle that? This is the longer-term horizon. Can we layer these new formats on top of 2110 and adapt systems in a legacy-compatible way where we continue to...
This is the challenge of anybody building new facilities, right? In the television industry and its related counterparts in other spaces are fundamentally affected by consumers. Consumers like HDR, right? So HDR is now rippling backward into everybody's plans for facilities. Every consumer TV you buy is a UHD display, so there's consumer interest in getting UHD quality to the displays. But that's now, right? 3 years from now, 4 years from now, what was at CES? Some of those things you see at CES will catch on and will get driven backward from the consumer industry into creating demand on the production industry. That's our life. So in 2110, we tried to crystal ball it as best we could. So the frames can go up to 32K by 32K. That sounds like a lot, but you start talking to medical imaging and some specialty people, and they say, well, I guess it'll fit. It's not outlandish when you talk about medical imaging to be in some of those resolutions. The frame rate can go to any rational number you want. There's a lot of those. So,
no more fractional ones, though, okay?
Well, no, fractions are rational. It's,
I know, but no more, no more, no more.
But the, so we tried to make the basics expandable, and also the language we use to describe what do these pixels mean. I think, like I said before, that's going to be the enduring legacy of 211020, is that language for describing the pixels, because that too can extend really well to whatever color space you want in the future, different HDR profiles, different transfer characteristics more generally. Because, we will, over time, now that we have these great HDR cameras and HDR displays, we're learning more faster about image science and human perception than we ever did before.
So I think 2110 is a complete solution for anything that is a raster of pixels. Okay, so anything that's got lines and pixels within lines, where you're talking about a two-dimensional array. It's pretty much got to be rectangular, although you can make some small and big rectangles and things like that in 2110. That's done. We don't need to do that work again. What we have will handle, as far as I can tell, anything in the future. 16-bit video, all kinds of crazy frame rates and things like that. Where new work might need to be done is if we start talking about voxels. We talk about volumetric pixels and things like that. 2110, I'm not sure that the standard as it exists today will be able to expand into that.
Yeah, that would take some work.
But
yeah.
Doable, but work.
But the timing model and the basic core, you define a new type of stream to handle those. Would it fit in the same model? And my assumption is, yeah, it would.
But the beauty of 2110 is that the infrastructure that it runs on is universal.
Right.
Packetized Ethernet is the way we communicate today, and I personally haven't seen anything on the horizon that's going to replace that. There is no alternative to Ethernet even tiptoeing into the market today.
Yeah, I think we got a good another 20, 30 years on that Ethernet thing.
I'm going to be retired and probably buried before something replaces that. So we're in really good shape with the infrastructure. Yes, if we have to go to voxels or something else like that, we'll change the endpoints out, but we're in good shape.
So the conclusion is we're good for another 20, 30 years at least with this stuff.
Yeah.
For the purposes of my planning horizon, I hope to be retired. Yeah.
So standards are in place. If you're looking at facilities and looking at 2110, count on it. Again, if you want to learn more, come by the SMPTE booth, talk to us. We'll get you involved. We're happy to host this session and tell you the role of standards and how we'll continue to play a role. SMPTE's been around 100 years, and hopefully we'll be around another 100 more and continuing this work. I want to thank Marty very much for allowing us to talk. So,
thanks. All right.
Thank you for my panelists.